As we explained in the previous lessons, there were many Chassidim who had the privilege that even though originally they were Misnagdim, they became Chassidim through their direct contact with the Alter Rebbe. And either it was a miracle, a mitzvah, that the Alter Rebbe performed, and that influenced them to see that the Alter Rebbe was really a great tzaddik, and they became a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, or it was through hearing directly from the Alter Rebbe himself the teachings of Chassidus, and sometimes it was by being exposed to the Alter Rebbe's vast knowledge and greatness in Nigla. And when they saw that, they saw the Alter Rebbe is truly a Torah giant, and they realized that all the stories that are told about the Alter Rebbe, the negative stories, are all false accusations. In fact, there was a story told by the Baruch Mordechai that even the Zundel himself was overwhelmed by the greatness of the Alter Rebbe in Nigla, but because of a certain technical detail, it never brought the Zundel to respect the Alter Rebbe as a result of it, which we'll soon see. And this is the story that the Baruch Mordechai told. The Baruch Mordechai himself was a Rav in the city of Boruch, that's why he was called the Baruch Mordechai Boruch, and he came from a Misnagdish family. His mother, however, remarried Reb Shmuel, the head of the Bezdin of Vilna. And later that led to him becoming the son-in-law of Reb Shmuel. So Baruch Mordechai actually became the son-in-law of Reb Shmuel, who was the head of the Bezdin of the Vilna community. Even though at that time he was already associated with Chassidim, he had met with Chassidim, he learned Chassidus, and he considered himself a Chassid. Nevertheless, it wasn't publicly known. Nobody knew that he was really a Chassid. So he still was associated with all the Torah scholars in Vilna. Even with the Vilna guy himself, he had contact, because nobody knew that he was really a Chassid. And Baruch Mordechai said the following: even before I came to the Alter Rebbe, personally, I heard about the Alter Rebbe's greatness in Nigla, in the revealed part of Torah. First of all, I heard about it from people who were here in Vilna, that they met the Alter Rebbe when he came to speak to the Vilna Gaon. We discussed this story in the previous lesson, that the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Mendel Herdaka, they went to meet personally with the Vilna Gaon, but he refused to meet with them. Even though the Vilna Gaon refused to meet with them, there were other people in Vilna. In fact, his father-in-law was one of them, Reb Shmuel, that had the opportunity to speak to the Alter Rebbe, and they were amazed, and they spoke about it with great respect of how great of a Gaon, of a brilliant Torah scholar the Alter Rebbe is. I also met with many of the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe who were great Torah scholars. And they repeated to me some of the Chidushim of the Alter Rebbe, some of the Alter Rebbe's interpretations and insights in Torah. Nevertheless, when I chose to go to Lozhna to see the Alter Rebbe himself, I went there not because of the Alter Rebbe's greatness in Nigla, even though I was a person who appreciated that, but I went there exclusively just to receive from the Alter Rebbe guidance in Avodas Hashem. The Hasidic way of serving Hashem, the Alter Rebbe should guide me. When I arrived in Lozhna, I found out that there's a very specific order and a schedule that one has to go through before they could meet the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe's brother, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, he was in charge of the people that came. He was responsible for finding them a place to eat, a place to sleep, and he would organize their tests. Everyone had to be tested in his Torah knowledge before he met with the Alter Rebbe. after the test, one was given a specific curriculum, a specific schedule, what they should do for the next 2 or 3 weeks, as a hachon, as a preparation for Yechidus. It's known that a chassid, before he went into Yechidus to the Rebbe, would always prepare himself, because this was a very special spiritual experience. So one had to be spiritually prepared. And there were chassidim who would say that they used to prepare themselves an entire year before they went to Yechidus. And there were some chassidim who said they prepared themselves 3 years. There was one chassid who said that he didn't go to the city of Lubavitch to meet the Rebbe until he had felt after 10 years that he's finally ready. Everyone on their level knew, though, that there has to be a hachana preparation. The one who used to test the guest was Reb Mordechai and Reb Moshe. These were the 2 other brothers of the Alter Rebbe. Both of them were Goinim, both of them were geniuses and Torah scholars, but Reb Mordechai, his knowledge and greatness was primarily in Talmud Bavli and in Rishonim. And the Goin Reb Moshe, his Torah knowledge was primarily in Talmud Yerushalmi and in the Rambam. There were times that both of them gave the person the test, and there were times that only one of them tested you. I personally was tested by both of them, and after my first Torah discussion with these 2 Torah giants, I was literally overwhelmed. I found myself like in a daze. I didn't know what was going on with me, being exposed to such greatness. I was then given 2 weeks to prepare, and after the 2 weeks, I finally had the chus to go into the Alter Rebbe. I presented my questions to the Alter Rebbe, which were questions in Avodas Hashem. How is best for me to serve Hashem according to the guidelines of Chassidus? And strange enough, the Alter Rebbe didn't answer my questions. Instead, the Alter Rebbe turned to me and said, "Do you have any questions in Nigla, and in which subjects?" The truth is, I did have questions. It was more than a year that I was carrying with me 2 questions that I had. One was in Talmud Yerushalmi, and the other one was in the Rambam. I had no way of explaining that difficult part of the Rambam and Gemara. I presented this to many Torah scholars, to many Goinim, geniuses of Torah. No one had an answer for me. Even the Vilna Goin himself, when I presented it to him, he actually repeated the question to me. He repeated it with more depth, and he concluded that he doesn't know the answer to this question. So when I was standing here in front of the Alter Rebbe, and he said to me, "Do you have any questions in Torah?" I decided to present these questions to the Alter Rebbe. How overwhelmed I was to hear the Alter Rebbe's answer. The answers were so deep, so brilliant, and they were given over with such brilliant clarity that I was literally stunned. I was actually numbed by this. I walked out of the Alter Rebbe's room. I didn't know, didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. They schlepped me into the dancing, as it's known that by the Alter Rebbe, and the same was by the Mittel Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, there was a dance called the Yechidus dance. That when, after a chassid went out of Yechidus, they would join into a dance, expressing their joy that they were able to have the merit to go into Yechidus and meet personally with the Rebbe. For some reason, it discontinued after the Tzemach Tzedek. So the Boruch says, as I walked out and I was schlepped into that dancing, I still didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything, because I was so emotional from the Alter Rebbe's answer. When I came back home, naturally my experience here had a change on my life from a Hasidic perspective, because I had gained more knowledge in terms of Chassidus and how to serve Hashem. But it also changed me in terms of my nigla. After meeting with all 3 brothers of the Alter Rebbe, Reb Mordechai and Reb Moshe and Reb Yehuda Leib, and also from the Alter Rebbe himself hearing things, I developed a much deeper understanding in my learning more than anything that I've experienced before. I learned to understand things with a whole new and deeper approach. I had a brother-in-law, whose name was Shlomo. He was not a chassid, and he knew about these two questions that I had. He also knew that I presented them to the Vilna Gaon, and the Vilna Gaon himself said that he has no answers to these questions. So I felt it's only right that now that I have the answers to these questions, I should share it with him. True, I wasn't going to tell him who I heard the answers from, because I didn't want him to know about my association with Chassidus and with the Alter Rebbe, but it's only right that he should at least know the answers. At the time that I came home, he was out of town, but a few months later, when he came home, I told him the answers to these questions. He got so excited, he said, "You must come with me to the Vilna Gaon. Let's present the questions to him, and let's see what he has to say about these answers." So we went together to the Vilna Gaon, and as soon as we began presenting the question, the Vilna Gaon immediately joined in and repeated the questions very briefly, and he added that quite a few times since then, I thought about these questions, but I still haven't found the proper answer. So Baruch Mordechai said, I gave over the answers of the Alter Rebbe to these two questions, to the Vilna Gaon. When the Vilna Gaon heard these answers, he was sitting there in his talis and film. He got so emotional, he stood up full height, and he said, these kind of answers can only have been said by the Reish Mesifta Berekia. We find this concept that there is also a yeshiva in Shamayim, and they also have a head of the yeshiva. Naturally, we're talking about souls learning Torah, and the head of the yeshiva is on a much higher plane. So the Vilna Gaon said, I can only imagine such an answer coming from that kind of Rosh Yeshiva. And if you heard this, if this was said by a Gaon or a Tzaddik, a human being here, he can only know this through a Ruach HaKodesh. And if I would have heard this from that Gaon and Tzaddik myself personally, I would say like Rabbi Yechanan said, Vilna mane abatraya lebei mesusa, which means I would be so humbled by this person. I would submit myself completely to this person that I would carry his clothes to the bathhouse. After this, my brother-in-law turned to the Vilna Gaon and said, but the Baruch Mordechai doesn't want to say who he heard the answers from. The Vilna Gaon looked at me very strongly, but didn't say anything. After this, though, I regretted why I never told the Vilna Gaon that this answer I heard from the leader of the Chassidim, that's how they called him in those days, the Alter Rebbe. Could be this would have changed the attitude of the Vilna Gaon towards the Alter Rebbe and towards Chassidim, and the whole machlokes could have been stopped. In fact, a number of years later, when the Vilna Gaon came out with a declaration to burn the Tanya, Rachmana litzlan, by that time everyone knew that I was already a chassid and connected to the chassidim. Nevertheless, I took advantage of my closeness and I went to speak to the Vilna Gaon. And I told him, do you remember that question that I presented to you and the answers that I gave you? And do you remember what you said? That you would say, like Rabbi Yechanan said, you'd be ready to carry this person's clothes to the bathhouse? I want you to know the Alter Rebbe is the one that gave me those answers. And I was hoping this would have an effect. But the Vilna Gaon didn't accept it from me. And he said that according to halacha, you're an negeya b'davar, and I can't accept what you're saying. In halacha, there's a concept that when a person comes to testify something, generally speaking, he's trusted. But if the issue is relevant to that person, they can either gain or lose, then their testimony is not accepted. So being that he's a chassid, his testimony about the Alter Rebbe's greatness can be accepted. And therefore, the Vilna Gaon would no longer hear about it. So this was a situation where the Vilna Gaon's entire attitude could have changed had he told him in the right time that this was really something which he heard from the Alter Rebbe. However, in most cases, the fact that Misnagdim became Chassidim, most of the hundreds and thousands of Misnagdim that that changed, it was because of their contact with the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim. They saw their greatness in Torah, they saw how they're God-fearing Jews, they're Yirei Shamayim, and they saw that all the stories they heard about them were literally false. People distorted the truth. And as a result of that, that's how tens and thousands of people became Chassidim. Everybody had their own personal experience. But there was one story which happened, which really had a general effect on a lot of people, changing their attitude towards the Chassidim. This was a letter that was sent by an individual who was actually infamous for his hate to Chassidim. His name was Zundel Volf, came from the city of Vilna, and he was known for the fact that he was an activist in fighting Chassidim. When there was an excommunication declared against the Chassidim in the times of the Mezritcher Maggid yet, and he had Tov Kuf Lamed Beis, as we discussed in one of the previous lessons, he was one of the people who went from town to town to publicize the excommunication. And many other things. In many situations, he literally endangered his life to carry out different actions against the Chassidim. Unfortunately, there was a very tragic point in the history of the conflict between Chassidim and Misnagdim, where 4 Chassidim in the city of Shvintzion were murdered, Rachmana litzlan. And this Reb Zundel Volf was part of that. This was connected to the fact that the city of Shvintzion had a number of Chassidim who were extremely successful in teaching Chassidus, and they managed to bring many, many people in the city of Shvintzion to become Chassidim. And this enraged the Misnagdim. So there was a committee of Misnagdim in the city of Vilna that decided something must be done about this. And they had a meeting with a committee of the city of Minsk and the city of Shklov. And they suggested to come out with an excommunication against the Chassidim in Shvintzion, and that would hopefully stop their activities. People who had nothing to do with them. But the committee of Minsk and Shklov didn't agree to go along with it. The reason was because by that time, so many more people in their own city became Chassidim, and they saw personally, they had a personal contact with Chassidim, and they saw that the Chassidim are really God-fearing Jews. They're Torah scholars. It's just that they have a different way in serving Hashem. But definitely not people who are the way the stories are told, that they're actually against Torah or they violate Torah, chas v'sholem. And as a result of that, there were many people who were previously involved in harassing Chassidim and fighting Chassidim, but they stopped all their activities once they realized that the Chassidim were really not what they thought they were. So the people of Minsk and Shklov didn't agree to go along. So instead they had a meeting with people from the cities of Brisk and Slutsk, also strong Misnagdish communities, and they did agree to the excommunication. But they only added, not only to make an excommunication against the Chassidim of Shvintzion, we should make an excommunication against all the Chassidim, and specifically against the Alter Rebbe. So they had a special meeting, and they decided they're going to announce this. And as the custom is, the 3 consecutive Shabbotim, and also when you read the Torah on Monday and Thursday, they made an announcement that on this specific day, there's going to be excommunication announced against the Chassidim and against their leader. And they announced in the name of the Vilna Gaon himself and the head of the Bezdin that all the Shiva students and all the students, even of the Chadorim, the younger students, they must all come to a specific designated place in the middle of the town, and that's the place where they're going to announce this excommunication. Even though they have to stop their learning, but it's extremely important because of the war against the Chassidim. The Chassidim in Vilna at that time, when they heard about it, there were a lot of Chassidim in Vilna at that time. This was in the year Tavkuf Mem or Tavkuf Mem Aleph, which is 1780 or 1781. There were already 4 Chassidish shuls there was a big yeshiva of Chassidim. There were 15 chadorim, which means 15 yeshivas for younger children. So when they heard about it, they pretty much disregarded the whole thing. They didn't take it seriously. But when they heard about this in the city of Shintian, they reacted. And when they made a meeting, and they decided to send messengers to all the different Hasidic communities in the area, that on that day we should all gather together in Vilna and have a very big celebration, which is a way of showing them that we're not intimidated by your excommunication. So the Chassidim of Shintian organized this, and people came from different cities in the area, and they all gathered together on that day in the city of Vilna. When the time finally came, they say that there were about 10,000 people gathered together there. The Chassidim got together, and they started to march through the streets. They were all dressed in Shabbos begodim. They were marching with musical instruments and singing. And this was at the same time they set up a platform in the middle of the street. They had the bezin there. They were there with black candles. The bezin was sitting with a white kittel and their talis, and they were ready to make the declaration. And suddenly, from the other part of town, they see this march of thousands of Chassidim marching, singing and dancing, and at the head of the group, the most prestigious Torah scholars that were known at that time, Rebbe Mordechai, as we mentioned him before, who was the son-in-law of the head of the Bezin of Vilna, that Moshe Meislish, who will discuss him later, he was actually a personal student of the Vilna Gaon, and he was the scribe of the community of Vilna, previously, before he became a chassid. Then there were others who were known in the city of Vilna as great people, and they became chassidim. And they were marching and singing and dancing. And as a result of that, people ran to see the march, and those people who were standing in the middle of the town with their black candles ready to announce an excommunication were left with a few people in numbers. And this had a tremendous, humiliating effect on the Bezdin. And as a result of that, they came out with a verdict to literally kill certain Chassidim in Shintian. And one of the people who was always enthusiastic about the mitzvah, so to speak, of harassing Chassidim and tormenting Chassidim was this Rebbe Zundel Volf. And he took part in this mission. Like I said before, this was really a very tragic point in history, and it just shows us to what degree there was such a lack of knowledge of what Chassidim were that they thought that this was something which is literally undermining Yiddishkeit, and that's why it has to be fought in such a way. It's interesting that now, we're talking about over 200 years later, everyone knows that what is a chassid and who is a chassid. Even in an English newspaper, they describe them as the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So someone who's careful with Cholav Yisrael is a chassid. He has long payas, he's a chassid. He wears 2 pairs of tefillin, he's a chassid. He has a beard, he must be a chassid. That not only that this is not something that undermines Yiddishkeit, but the exact opposite is true, that this is, and the Chassidim have displayed throughout the years, the strongest connection to Yiddishkeit and loyalty to Yiddishkeit, that under the most difficult circumstances in Russia and at the times of the Holocaust, how strong they stood in their loyalty to Yiddishkeit, and they gave strength and inspiration to all those around them. This Rebbe Zundel Volf was known for his activity, for his being an activist, and yet one time he himself had contact with Chassidim, and one incident after another, and they began to realize that the Chassidim are actually truly God-fearing Jews. And the Chassidim are actually Torah scholars. And they realized that the stories that they heard about them were actually distortions. And it was beyond himself. Knowing all the things that he did all these years, and of course knowing what he did in the city of Shintian. And he wrote the Vilna Gaon everything that he discovered. And he asked the Vilna Gaon that he should give him a tikkun, a way of tshuva, that he can do tshuva for everything that he did, especially for being involved in killing the 4 Chassidim of Shvinzion. And he ended his letter by saying that nobody knows until the last day of his life what is going to be when it comes to judgment in the heavenly court. And imagine, he said, he writes in his letter, that the true responsible people for this blood, for the bloodshed, are actually the Bezdin of Vilna, because they're the one that gave this verdict. And all the people, the committee who was behind all this activity. This letter from Zundel Volf, the Chassidim made copies of this, and hundreds of copies of this letter went out to the entire area, and you can imagine what kind of effect this had on the Misnagdisha communities. Of course, those that were serious-minded and truly God-fearing Jews were affected by this, to no longer be involved in any of the activities against Chassidim. But unfortunately, those who had their own agenda, and they thrived on machlokes, they just enjoyed seeing that more conflict, that there should be more conflict, and they would love to increase the machlokes. And to them it was just a power struggle. Who's going to get it their way? They were angered by this letter. And naturally it provoked them to work even harder in attacking the Chassidim. But again, the average Misnagid, who was a God-fearing Jew, was moved by this letter in a positive direction.